So hello and welcome everyone to another talk organized by İstanbul University, Faculty of Theology. Today we have a distinguished guest from Scotland, from Edinburgh, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Sohaib Saeed. Dr. Sohaib Saeed studied at Al-Azhar University, Jamiatul Al-Azhar, and then he holds a PhD from University of London from SOAS, في علوم القرآن, or Quranic Sciences. His PhD thesis is entitled as Intra-Quranic Hermeneutics, Theories and Methods in Tafsir of Quran through the Quran. He had been fellow in a number of institutions and published a number of articles and monographs as well. He's been to Edinburgh and Freiburg in Germany as well. He is also founder of Center for Advanced Study of the Quran and its Interpretation. Recently, he has translated a monumental work by Fakhruddin al-Razi, the great medieval scholar, Islamic scholar, whose work entitled as Tafsir al-Kabir. He has translated the first volume of this great exegesis. Today he is going to deliver a talk entitled as Between Resurrection and Rationalisation, defending AbuMuslim's reading of Baqarah, verse 260. So, Dr. Sohaib, thank you for accepting our invitation. We're very happy and pleased to have you here at İstanbul University, Faculty of Theology. And without further ado, I'm going to give you the microphone, leave the floor for you. But before that, I'd like to remind a couple of housekeeping rules. Please do keep your microphone switched off during the talk. We will have a Q&A session in the end for 15 or 20 minutes. You can either directly ask your question or write them in the chat, so we wouldn't have any communication problem. Dr. Sohaib Saeed, the floor is yours. Please, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start with the presentation. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Our topic today is a verse of Surah Al-Baqarah concerning Ibrahim, Prophet Abraham, and the birds. And our title is Between Resurrection and Rationalisation. And here we are discussing two views which exist concerning this verse. In particular, a view which has been seen as a minority view, as a marginalized view, as a controversial view, as a rejected view by many. And that is the view of Abu Muslim al-Asfahani. So I'll outline what that is about. And we are going to go through some of the contours of how it has been received in the exegetical tradition, the type of criticisms that have been directed towards his reading of this verse, and in particular, some examples of what's happened in the field of translation and English translation especially, because unfortunately I cannot comment on Turkish translations, but I hope that I will open up the questions for you to explore and provide some answers to make this picture more complete. So the verse in question we will look at in its Arabic to begin with. وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى. So it refers to a time when Abraham has said, "My Lord, show me how you give life to the dead." قَالَ أَوَلَمْ تُؤْمِنْ قَالَ بَلَى وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. He said, that is, God said to him, "Have you not already believed? Do you not have faith?" He said, "Yes, indeed, but so that my heart will be at rest." So there is lots of discussion around these parts of the verse, the nature of the question, the nature of the answer, but those issues are not our current concern. But it is what comes next. It is what he is instructed to do. قال فخذ أربعة من الطير فصرهن إليك. He said, so take 4 birds and then صرهن إليك, and here is where there is a divergence in how it will be translated. Even amongst the standard view, amongst the majority of the mufassirin, there are 2 views about how to translate this part. Either صرهن is meaning cut them up, or it means incline them towards you. So that is even before we open up the door of what Abu Muslim says. For Abu Muslim, only the second one is acceptable as a view, that is to incline them towards you. ثم اجعل على كل جبل منهن جزءا, and then place on every mountain from them a part. ثم ادعهن يأتينك سعيا واعلم أن الله عزيز حكيم, and then call them, they will come to you at haste, and know that God is mighty, wise. So for the most part, the translation can be shared between the 2 points of view. So when looking at the verse, before getting into Abu Muslim in particular, here are some general questions that we would ask and explore with regards to this ayah or perhaps any other. What did it mean at the time of revelation to the first hearers? This is placing it in its historical reality, historical context, historical reading and understanding. What did it mean to the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he received it and heard it? What does it mean? That is to say, does it have meanings on top of those things which it carried in its first context? Does it have further meanings on top of that? What can it mean? Is there scope for different points of view concerning the verse? And if so, what is the range of those different opinions and those different interpretations and readings of the verse and implications of the verse? What can it mean for different questions that we might ask that we bring to the verse? And in order to determine the answers to these questions, where do we start? So for example, do we start with the words of the verse, the language, the Arabic? Do we start with narrations? Because in some approaches to tafsir, some precedence is given to what has been said. Do we start with the mufassirin and what they have concluded, their glosses and explanations? Do we start with translations, which is just another form of tafsir? And how do we decide? So when we're faced by multiple points of view, do we decide just to go with the majority, even the vast majority? That might be one approach. What are the areas that we need to investigate? How do we determine that one view is stronger or better or preferable to another? So we'll try to explore these in a practical way. So the alternative view. What I'm calling the alternative view, I put in these inverted commas in order to say, well, it is alternative because we have something which is the established view. So when something has become established, the other thing becomes alternative, and that is putting it in a neutral sense, okay? But in a less than neutral sense, some would call this shadh, marjuh, right? It is aberrant, it is irregular, it is rejected, it is depreciated, whatever. I'm using a term which is somewhat more neutral. That is to say, it is alternative because by sheer numbers, it is a minority view, even to the extent of almost being the view of one man. And that is the way that the tafsir tradition certainly has presented it at times. So that man was Abu Muslim al-Asfahani, Muhammad ibn Bahr. He was a Mu'tazili thinker, at the same time, a very free-minded, independent one, it seems, even amongst the Mu'tazila. He is often quoted by Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, whom, as was mentioned before, I have had the honor to translate for. But al-Razi sometimes accepts what he quotes from Abu Muslim, sometimes criticizes it, and sometimes, as I believe is happening here, is almost silent on his exact stance towards what Abu Muslim has said. Even before al-Razi, Abu Muslim was actually quoted by al-Hakim al-Jishumi, whose work has been more recently published. So most of those who have encountered Abu Muslim's opinion on this verse have encountered it via al-Razi. But al-Razi was not the first person to quote it and even to critique it, because al-Jishumi also refutes Abu Muslim's view in quite similar terms. And then al-Razi presents a list of arguments against Abu Muslim's view. But my own view about al-Razi is that he is actually just quoting criticisms that came from someone before him. And I believe, based on reading around the subject, that the person he's quoting is Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. That would become known if we manage to find, especially if my Turkish colleagues can find any manuscript amongst all the manuscript collections of Abdul Jabbar's tafsir, we might have a definitive answer to this and many, many other things that we'd like to know. But the opinion of Abu Muslim, although it has been mentioned in a few works subsequently, has received little engagement in the subsequent tafsir tradition. Al-Alusi, important Ottoman mufassir, of course, mentioned it again and refuted it again in some more terms than Al-Razi did. And then we have some at the turn of the 20th century who have actually championed the view of Abu Muslim. One of them was in the Indian subcontinent, Sanaullah Amritsari, whose commentary in Arabic contains this view. And he met a lot of criticism from his fellow scholars of the Ahli Hadith movement. So there's a whole story there to be told, which we will not tell just now. But this view was one amongst a number of things that he mentioned in his tafsir, some 40 points that were criticized by his compatriots and his contemporaries, and for which he faced a lot of, he indulged in a lot of discussion and defense of his view as well. And then there's Muhammad Rashid Rida, whom we're going to speak more about in a moment. He also faced criticism for bringing up this view, especially by some Shi'i exegetes like Tabatabai, have specifically listed a number of points in refutation of Abu Muslim and of Rashid Rida for his additional points by which he tried to defend Abu Muslim. So let's say from the start, we have mentioned that Abu Muslim is a Mu'tazili. So is this a Mu'tazili opinion? Is this the Mu'tazili opinion? Is it even a Mu'tazili opinion? I would say that is questionable. Because in the first place, the Mu'tazila, like Al-Hakim Al-Jishumi, whom we mentioned, refuted it. Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, it seems, refuted it. Al-Zamakhshari does not even mention this view. So it doesn't seem to be popular amongst the Mu'tazila, that much we can say based on the written record that we have. Here I'm showing, this is from, because there's no critical edition of Tafsir al-Razi, so I decided to choose something from a manuscript. This is from one of the Ayah Sophia manuscripts. And we don't have to read all of this, but this is the section where he presents the arguments that Abu Muslim makes. And then he, underneath this blue line, وَاحْتَجَّ الْقَائِلُونَ بِالْقَوْلِ الْمَشْهُورِ بِوُجُوهِ. And then he mentions the things in defense of the standard view, of the majority view. And very clearly here he's saying those who maintained the majority view made the following arguments. So these are not his arguments that he's generating by himself. I think that much is clear. As for where Al-Razi stands on the question, I feel that he has not made that abundantly clear. So it is reasonable to assume that Al-Razi agrees with the majority. That is very reasonable. But all I'm saying is he didn't make it explicit. So as we mentioned, there are some advocates in the modern times. I mentioned Sanaullah Amritsari, but I want to focus on Rashid Rida and one other person you'll see in a moment. So Muhammad Rashid Rida, of course, very famous for Tafsir al-Manar. It is based on the teachings of Muhammad Abdu. And certainly for Surah al-Baqarah, we would expect there's an input from both of them with regards to favoring Abu Muslim's opinion. So in 1906, it was first published in the Majalla, and then it came into the printed tafsir. I'm going to show you in a moment that actually the printed tafsir of Al-Manar is missing 4 lines, which were in the Majalla, and they're very crucial lines, very interesting lines, but all our copies of Tafsir Al-Manar, as far as I know, are missing them, so you will get them from my next slide, inshallah. He praises Abu Muslim's opinion, and he sees it as the Zahir, the evident reading. Or he uses the word mutabadir maybe. It is what is most obvious, what is most apparent from the verse. And for Rida, he sees that the only reason that people went with the other view is that they were influenced by the narrations. And this is an important question and a point of debate here, which we're going to indulge in a little bit. What really is the apparent meaning? What would you understand from this ayah if you didn't have a prior conception that Ibrahim chopped up the birds, that he was to chop them into small pieces and place them on the mountains? So he provides supporting arguments for Abu Muslim, and he responds to Al-Razi because he believes that the points are from Al-Razi. As I've said to you, they are most likely from Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. And one of the key points that he makes is that a juz of one group, a juz of a group is one individual from that group, and a juz of one individual is a piece. So we're going to see that text in a moment, but let me just ask the question here at the bottom. Rashid Rida, we know about him and his quote-unquote modernist tendencies, and him and Muhammad Abdu, and then various translators who adopted it as well. We're going to see, like Muhammad Asad, are also known for these kind of tendencies. So is it a modernist opinion? Is it a naturalist opinion? Is it based on rejecting the possibility of the supernatural, the possibility that Abraham was being called upon to raise the dead, to bring the dead back to life? Is this opinion based on a denial of miracles? Well, I would question this as well, because denying that this verse itself is talking about a supernatural event does not in any way lead to saying that you reject all supernatural events. If Rashid Rida has a tendency to explain away a lot of the supernatural explanations, it doesn't mean that we are bound to follow him in all those opinions. We might still find value in what he is saying about this particular verse and this particular story. So I'm sorry that this is probably quite low resolution and blurry, but what he says here in his response to Al-Razi, he says, أقول, what Al-Razi has mentioned in response to Abu Muslim, none of it is any good. The strongest part is what he said about the juz, because what's something that Al-Razi quotes, he says, ثم جعل على كل جبل منهن جزءا, then place a juz, a part of them, on every mountain. So he says, now Abu Muslim wants the juz here to refer to a single bird. So one bird is called here a juz. Place a one on each mountain. So Al-Razi, or the person himself, Abdul Jabbar perhaps, is saying this is linguistically possible. It is linguistically possible, but he says it is more apparent that it refers to a part, like a body part or a piece. Now, Rashid Rida here says that وَجُزْء الْمُتَعَدِّد واحد, a juz of a multiple is one member of the set. وَجُزْء الْوَاحِدْ قِطْعَةٌ مِنْهُ, but a juz of a single thing is a piece of it. Okay, so then he says about the issue of ijma', because the other main thing that is mentioned by Al-Razi and others is that Abu Muslim's opinion violates consensus. All of the Mufassirin have said that Abraham took the birds and chopped them up and put the pieces on the mountain and called them, and they came back to life. And some of them added numerous details, which kind of birds they were, and so on. Some of them said he was holding the heads of the birds and then the pieces came back and attached to the heads. Details which could only be known through revelation if that is available in this particular case. So he says, as for the issue of ijma', this is a very strange thing, he says, for Al-Razi to bring up. Because Al-Razi is a great usuli, he knows that ijma' is not relevant to a situation like this. And he doesn't exactly elaborate on why it's not relevant. But I think that Rida's point is, this is not a point of law, for example, where it would be necessary for everyone to know and to articulate the right understanding. But it is something where it is a story about something that happened, in the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And as for how it is understood, it's not something that the whole ummah has to, is bound to understand. Therefore, you'd expect the ijma' to be very important in that situation. We'll come back to talk a bit more about ijma' later. But he says, it's not in this kind of, في مثل هذه المسألة مع مثل الذين كتبوا التفسير قبل أبي مسلم. And then he says, Al-Razi himself, Al-Razi and the other Mufassirin would go against this kind of ijma' without any problem. So this is where we get back to the part that's in the printed book. وَكَمْ مِنْ آيَةٍ فَهِمَ الرَّازِي وَغَيْرُهُ فِيهَا خِلَافَ مَا فَهِمَهُ جَمِيعُ الْمُفَسِّرِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ. So these are some of the points that Rashid Rida brings up. Now I'm going to talk about another figure at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. And this is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. He is the founder of what is known as the Ahmadiyya movement. He claimed to be the promised Messiah and to be the Mahdi and various other titles and designations. And the relevance of him is not only in the fact of what he mentioned, but the influence that he had on the subsequent translation movement. So we're going to see that in a moment. But with regards to his own opinion, there seems to be, as early possibly as 1891, but certainly in printed materials around 1903, so slightly before Rashid Rida, a mention of his view on this verse in which he considers it to be, again, not about chopping, but about a rational demonstration. And this point was then elaborated by his son, who is the second caliph of their movement, Bashir ad-Din Mahmud. And now they have added a certain symbolism to the whole story. The birds are not just birds, but they are symbolizing the rise and fall of nations. So the death of those birds is the fall of the nations, and then the rise of them, the resurrection of them, is the restoration of those nations. And then the last bird they make for their own movement. So the fourth bird is the Ahmadiyya or Ghulam Ahmad himself, something like this. But what's interesting about their engagement with this issue is that in their writings, they would not credit this view to Abu Muslim. Now, it is likely that they encountered this view by reading Tafsir al-Razi, because al-Razi was known to some of those writers like Muhammad Ali and others. So it could have been taken from them. I don't find that there's a precedent within the Indian subcontinent, for example, Sir Said Ahmed Khan or anyone has not mentioned this view or adopted this view of Abu Muslim. But instead, it is presented as if it is just the correct view coming from this claimant to be the Messiah. So for that movement, it is not a matter of, well, this is a scholarly opinion. A scholarly opinion can be taken left, can be debated, accepted, rejected. Like when Muhammad Rashid Rida tells us that, his arguments, we may say, well, those are good arguments, or we may say, I disagree with your arguments, so we can take or leave. But in a way, this opinion has become a kind of official doctrine, something like that, for this particular movement. So let us go on then to see something about the translations. And again, as I said, I will be focusing on English translations. And although I will actually mention some that are in other languages preceding the first English translations. So among the translations in English, we have some which follow the majority interpretation explicitly. So what happens is they have to either translate the word surhunna as chop, which I don't think is very common, and that is a view attributed to Ibn Abbas, or they take surhunna ilayka as incline them to you, familiarize them with you, but then they put in brackets, then kill them and chop them up. Because then the instruction, then place a piece of them on every mountain, it is sort of understood as implied that there has to be a killing and chopping before being able to place them on the mountain. Also, of course, if you're going to call them, and this is supposed to demonstrate bringing them back to life, if they're going to come back to life, then they have to be dead before they are brought back to life. So if you understand that the ayah is telling Ibrahim how to bring them back to life and having him do that, then of course they have to be killed first. So some of the translations place that in explicitly because they need the reader in English to understand that killing and chopping happened. They don't want you to get confused. But then there are other translations which are open to both interpretations. Perhaps because the translator inclined to one view or the other, or was not sure, or didn't realize that they need to perhaps be clearer for their readers, or they wanted to be ambiguous to allow you to understand it either way. There are some which are open like this, but you have a footnote which explains what the translator believes to be the correct way to understand it. And then you have a few translations which are explicit in following AbuMuslim's view or the minority view, where they will say place each of them, not a piece of them, but each of the birds on a mountain. So here I've given a quick survey of the Orientalist translations preceding the 20th century. We have the ones in Latin, Italian, and French. They all mention chopping. They all mention chopping. And then the English translations, the translation of Ross is based on the French one that's mentioned here, and George Sale is based on Marachi, who's not mentioned here. There is a kind of lineage amongst the Orientalists as well. And what also should be mentioned is the Orientalists were sometimes using exegetical sources of Muslims, like Jalalain. So they would mention sometimes, like George Sale tells us, this is in Jalaluddin, by which he means Jalalain. So either they were convinced of that this is what the verse is talking about, or they were simply influenced by the fact that Muslims have been reading it that way. Otherwise, I suppose it's an interesting question to speculate. Would they have seen it that way? Would they have assumed that what happened here was the birds were killed and chopped? But these, as we see, sometimes explicit in the English, cut them all together in pieces, divide them, cut them in pieces. And these are things which are not explicit in the text, because here in Rodwell, for example, take them 4 birds and draw them towards thee, that's surhunna ilayk. And then and cut them in pieces is, there's no words left in the Arabic for it. So the normal practice in translation would be to place that in brackets to indicate that it is implied and not stated. You can also see here that there are a number of them who make a reference to Genesis 15. In Genesis 15, there is a story which has been taken somewhat to be linked to this one. And I won't be going into depth in that. I have done in my paper, which I've published on this subject. But the text in Genesis 15 doesn't seem to correspond very closely, yet it gave them reason to think that this story is about chopping, because there is some chopping that happens in that story. We'll come back to this point. Then amongst the Ahmadis, as I mentioned, for whom this interpretation is the official one, we find that place each one of them. Abdul Hakim Khan was a member, a close associate of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, but then he abandoned that movement and turned against the Ahmadiyya just before he died soon after this. So he says, place each one of them on a hill, then call them. And he mentions in his footnote how this is metaphorical for how God will call together the atoms of the universe. Muhammad Ali, who was a founder of the Lahore branch of the Ahmadiyya, so they split off from the main body, if you like, which is the Qadiani branch, and then you have the Lahori branch, which is Muhammad Ali was one of the main figures of. In his translation, he says, then train them to follow you, then place on every mountain a part of them. But in his footnote, he discusses this at length and argues that there is no chopping involved, and he mentions Ar-Razi, and he mentions that this story is a puerile, that is to say, a very unconvincing story, which is the mainstream exegesis of the verse. I've mentioned here 2 others before Sher Ali. Sher Ali is in a way the official translation of the Ahmadiyya. I think I put the date wrong here in the slide, because although it might have been sort of started in 1936, his translation comes out considerably later. I might just see if I can, 1955. So again, then put each of them on a hill. In between that, I've mentioned Ghulam Sarwar, who has taken the same view, and he might have done that under the influence of some of these translators. And the same with Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who we'll see in a bit more detail in a moment. Later on, Muhammad Asad, who is known for his inclination towards some of the views of the modernists like Abdu and Rida. He often takes from Zamakhshari and Ar-Razi as well and quotes them. He has this, teach them to obey thee, then place them separately on every hill around thee. And he tells us that he's getting this from Ar-Razi. and particularly from Abu Muslim. Professor Abdul Halim, my own PhD supervisor and mentor, he has then placed them on separate hilltops. So he understands it that way. In his footnote, he explains that it shouldn't be understood the other way, but the footnote is not clear as to what the other opinion is supposed to be, because the footnote sounds kind of the same. If you see here, the majority then place them separately on hilltops. The majority view is not place them separately on hilltops, but place the pieces of them on the hilltops. Also, the Study Quran, the recent publication, well, 7 years ago now, it feels like yesterday, which is headed by Sayyid Nasr Hussein, right? Sayyid Hussein Nasr, sorry. So the Study Quran has take 4 birds and make them be drawn to thee, then place a piece of them on every mountain. Again, this is not explicit in which side it takes, but the footnote tells you, read this in line with, he says Ar-Razi, but of course, what is meant is Abu Muslim. Now, this Yusuf Ali, I'm sharing this example just to say this view has sometimes proven so controversial that people have sought to excise it and delete it and replace it and remove it and hide it from the history of tafsir and from the history of translation. So Yusuf Ali, in his original edition, and this is something like the original edition on the left, he has take 4 birds, tame them to turn to thee, put a portion of them on every hill. And then in a footnote, he makes clear the way he understands this. He says that MP, he mentions here Marmaduke Pickthall is non-committal, but HGS, Hafiz Ghulam Sarwar, and MMA, Maulvi Muhammad Ali of the Lahore Ahmadiyya, understand that the birds were not killed, but a portion here means a unit, that is to say, a single bird. So he takes this to be clearly the better way of reading Surhunna Ilaik and of reading the whole verse. That is in the 1930s and until the Saudis get to it in the 1980s. So after Yusuf Ali has passed away, his work is revised by a committee at the King Fahd complex of Medina. And on the right, I've got an image here which shows you what they did to this particular verse. Here they have take 4 birds, tie them, brackets, cut them into pieces, close brackets, then put a portion of them on every hill. So this is also a slightly strange reading of them, but we can find in some of the tafsirs that surhunna is explained as wathiqhunna, that is tie them. But that's also quite an unusual view, not one of the very standard ones. But in the footnote, as I've marked here in red, they removed all this kalam about Maulvi Muhammad Ali and all this stuff, and they made it seem as if Yusuf Ali is siding with the quote-unquote received commentators. In actual fact, he was deliberately disagreeing with the received commentators. So that's all fixed. And then later on comes the internet. And somehow in the age of the internet, a new version of Yusuf Ali's translation has popped up, and I don't know how exactly it happened. But if you go to just about any website now, including Quran.com, which I'm now responsible for its content, so inshallah I will fix this, but we didn't fix it yet. For research purposes, I've left it as it is, so you can check. If you go to Quran.com/2/260 and we look up Yusuf Ali's translation, we will find this last thing. Draw them to you and cut their bodies to pieces. It is neither Yusuf Ali's original translation nor the King Fahd revision. Instead, it bears a strong resemblance to N.J. Nasim Dawood's translation, a Jewish translator. It seems that someone was unhappy with Yusuf Ali's translation and just went and fetched a different one and stuck it in its place. And this is the wonders of the internet. And interestingly, a number of researchers who have written about this verse, they fell for the trap and they didn't check the printed editions to see what this was. They mistook it for the Saudi revision. It's not. Right. So let's get into the details now of how to read and how to debate the way that this verse is worded. So the first thing is the question of what is the meaning of surhunna ilaik? And by the way, there's another canonical reading which is sirhunna ilayk. And there is some discussion as to, is surhunna and sirhunna, do they mean exactly the same thing? Do they extend to slightly different meanings? Those are details that I cover in my paper. But basically, the debate surrounds both of those words. Either one can be said to mean chop, or it could be said to mean incline, right? So, as Abu Muslim points out, what happens if we take it to mean chop? Surhunna ilayk, chop them to you. Something strange about this. And yes, those who maintain the standard view have answers to this, but those answers are not entirely clear. Those answers are not immediately obvious. So when it is said that Abu Muslim is following the zahir and the apparent meaning of the words, there is some merit to that argument. Whereas mostly he would be accused of going against the zahir of the ayah. The obvious thing in the ayah is that Ibrahim is chopping the birds, but Abu Muslim has done something strange by suggesting otherwise. Well, Abu Muslim, it seems, in this point, is following a more natural reading of surhunna ilayk, yeah, incline them to you. If it does mean incline them to you, is the inclination done so that Ibrahim will recognize the birds? Or is the inclination done so that the birds will recognize Ibrahim? Right? In Abu Muslim's view, the point is that the birds are supposed to recognize Ibrahim, so that when he calls them back, they will come flying back to him. They will recognize his voice, they will recognize his call, and they will respond to his call. Right? In the standard view, you kind of have to question why are they to be trained and tamed? If it's just about chopping them, just take 4 birds and kill them. Right, that's it. Because why is the need to familiarize yourself? It's almost as if they believe that Ibrahim has to familiarize himself with them so that he recognizes them when they come back to life, so that he really believes that God has brought them back to life. So all of this feeds into the idea that Ibrahim is having a profound doubt about God's ability to bring the dead back to life. That is a very difficult proposition to maintain, that Ibrahim is doubting that. And as we'll see in a moment, or in a few moments actually, his specific question was, show me how you give life to the dead, not show me that you do, or convince me that you do, but set my heart at rest regarding how you do so. So we'll ponder on that a bit more a little later. Now, here under the arrow, why this particular word? This is now where I'm starting to insert myself into the situation. So there's this long debate between various people, and then here is Sohaib. He has a point of view. He wants to theologize. He wants to be a hermeneut or an exegete. So this is my attempt. So the question that occurs to me is, why does God use this particular word, surhunna ilayk or sirhunna ilayk, rather than another word which could have been clearer in meaning, one meaning or the other, right? But for some reason, the word surhunna is used. Also, this word is not a common word in the Quran, right? There are things that are related to it and have the same root, but the exact word surhunna or sur, is not found in other ayat. So that's why I put here hapax. It's a hapax legomenon, that is to say, it is a singly occurring word. And when that happens, that also invites you to say, well, what is the reason, if we can possibly determine it? What is the wisdom in this word choice? As opposed to, for example, if I think that it's about inclining, why did God not just say then, فَأَمِلْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ? Right? Then we wouldn't have a debate about what does it mean. So I have 2 possible answers for this, and I hope that you will like them. This is the juicy bit of the talk, right? Why this particular word? Number 1, the word surhunna has a relation to the word taswir, which is designing and fashioning and forming. So that is that God is al-musawwir. So when Ibrahim is being told surhunna ilayk, there is a kind of pun, there's a kind of connection, a wordplay, an allusion that brings to mind the act of taswir. Surhunna ilayk, as if you are the musawwir. you're going to train them in such a way that you are forming them in your image. You are implanting your image on them. You are making them your birds, right? So in the position of al-musawwir in this particular way, you then can understand that just as you will train these birds and they will recognize you, well, God Almighty is al-musawwir, and every atom of creation has his imprint and is in his image, to use a certain way of expression that we have in some hadith, as you know, or carries his image or recognizes him, and therefore knows that he is their maker. Now, on the other side, we have as-sur, وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ. And as-sur, there is some explanations as to why the horn which is blown on the Day of Judgment by the angel, why is it called as-sur? Maybe because because inclination includes curving and a horn is curved. That could be one reason. But either way, the sur sounds like saur, as-saur, surhunna. There is again a connection, a mental connection that is made by using a word that evokes the other word. So, just as you will be the musawwir as at the beginning of the story of these birds, likewise you will call them ثُمَّ دُعُوهُنَّ يَأْتِينَ كَسَعْيَا. And in the same way, when the call is made, وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ, then everything will come rushing back to its maker, who has implanted it and made them recognize the maker. So that's possibility number one, as for why the word surhunna is used. Number two possibility is what I am calling meaningful ambiguity. And this is a kind of manhaj, an approach to tafsir that I'm working on and trying to make more sense of. That is to say, in some situations, in some ayat, we find that two opinions are so strong in their own way that you can hardly decide which one of them is correct. Now here I'm not talking about Abu Muslim versus the Jumhur. Here I'm talking about just the word surhunna. Does it mean chop or does it mean incline? Just that point. That point is what the generality of exegetes continued to differ on. So here's my proposition. This word is used because it has this duality or this ambiguity. The ambiguity is not a problem to be solved so much as it is itself a feature of the verse, because it allows you to see both of those meanings in it. Why? Not so that you are left in confusion as to which one happened or which one was supposed to happen. Instead, this is how I propose the meaningful ambiguity works. I believe that the primary meaning is the one that Abu Muslim intended. That is to say, incline them to you. Incline them to you. So Ibrahim is being made to consider, if you were to get those birds and to train them, then they will come back to you. But then the chopping meaning is as if to say, even if you chop them up, if you have imprinted yourself on them enough, then even if you were to chop them, this is mubalagha, this is hyperbole, even if you were to chop them into tiny pieces and put them on every mountain in the world, ala kulli jabal, which again is a hyperbole expression, right? Because then the Mufassirin said, oh, does it mean 4 mountains? Does it mean 8 mountains? Were there 7 mountains? And nobody knows. But the wording of the verse is on every mountain. If you were to chop them finally and place them on every mountain, they would still come back to you. And if that's the case, then know that God Almighty, is Azizun Hakim, right? So this is my proposition as to why the word surhunna is used here. And obviously that comes more in support of Abu Muslim's view than the other. More on the wording. First of all, often it is said or seen that the weakest point of Abu Muslim's view is juz'a. ثُمَّ جَعَلَ عَلَى كُلِّ جَبَلٍ مِّنْهُنَّ جُزْءًا, a piece. Because, and that's what I used to think also, but I changed my mind. The weakest point of Abu Muslim's view, in my perspective, is فَخُذْ. Yeah, the instruction khudh, but we'll come back to this. But juz'a, I now believe, is very straightforward. But we have just been conditioned, I think, to think of juz as being the mashed up pieces. Because in the standard view, it's not a piece of the birds. What it is is the birds were to be chopped and then their remains to be mixed, and then a portion of that mixture to be placed. So in a way, the word juz is being made to carry all of that complexity in the standard view. In AbuMuslim's view, it's much more straightforward. You have 4 birds, so each one of them is a juz of the 4. And that meaning of juz is attested, as some like Sanaullah Amr Sari mentioned. In Surah Al-Hijr, for example, لها سبعة أبواب, talking about Jahannam, of course. لكل باب منهم جزء مقسوم. So each door among those doors has minhum, from among the unbelievers, جزء مقسوم. So a juz of the unbelievers will be a portion to every door. And this is not understood to mean pieces of them or mixture of their pieces. It means a subset of them. So when you have only 4 birds, a subset is 1, or it could indeed be 2, could even be 3, could be a juz even. But the easiest meaning is على كل جبل منهن جزء, is 1 bird on each hill. Now I'm going to do the same thing I did in the previous slide and ask the question, why this particular word? What is it about this word that is meaningful? What I think is achieved by saying juz'a instead of wahidan, or tayran, or ta'iran, place a ta'ir or a bird or one of them on every hill. Instead, juz'a, because it brings you back to the original meaning that's being referred to. The bird is the symbol. The referent is the body parts, which are to be disintegrated, the atoms of creation. So place a juz. Thinking of the bird as a juz reminds you of what it is standing for, which is the parts of the body. So that's my point of view about why the word juz is used rather than an easier one that is clearer in its meaning. So points of debate and tarjih, and inshallah we're getting close to the end. The last 2 slides now. Okay, so points of debate and how do we decide between the views. So some more points about the wording. Ibrahim is saying, show me how. Show how. He's not asking, prove to me that you can raise the dead, because first of all, we would not doubt that Abraham was free of any doubt in this respect, right? And in fact, being asked to show me how is not satisfied by just doing it. Okay, if he says show me how, and then God says place some dead birds far away, and then later on you'll see that I have brought them to life because they'll come flying back to you, but he hasn't seen anything. The resurrection happened on the faraway mountain. So for me, the standard view does not explain well how this is showing how. And likewise at the end of the ayah, although there are different points of view, but Rashid Rida has a particular point of view about why Azizun Hakim is explained better by by AbuMuslim's view. Let me just quote to you what he says. So he says that he's told to appreciate the attributes of supremacy, izzah, and wisdom. And that's a comment on the whole of Abraham's question and the answer. And you can see more in the paper to save time. AbuMuslim is also seeing that the instruction to take 4 birds, is not necessarily a literal instruction. Ibrahim alayhi salam does not need to actually do it in order for this to work, because this is a rationalization. It is a rational demonstration. It is to take, but it is in a way a mental taking, right? So he gives examples, or some others give examples, like if you were to ask, how did you make these beautiful cookies? And you said, well, take this amount of flour and take this amount of butter and this amount of sugar and take some chocolate chips and buy this. You give the instruction. You're not commanding to do it, but you're just saying, if you were to do this, then you will see the result, which is the cookies, or in this case, you will understand something about how God gives life to the dead. Another point of debate here in the second part is how compelling is the consensus? We touched on this earlier, but I would add also that the nature of the tafsir tradition is one that is more cumulative, it's more repetitive than it is one which is based on consensus. So if a mufassir comes to this ayah and he sees that before him, it's been explained in this way that Abraham chopped the birds and they were brought back to life. And if he sees no problem with that, he will write it in his book, and it will continue to go on like that. So we could see this as a type of consensus. We could. But it's a different kind of consensus than one in which mujtahid, a group of mujtahideen of different countries, and they all exert their reasoning regarding a fiqhi point, for example, and they independently reach the same conclusion. That is a very strong kind of ijma', as opposed to ijma', which is just, well, I said this because people before me said it and I repeated it. I saw no problem with it. Because what happens is someone can come along and say, okay, we have been saying this, but I feel like people before me may not have thought about the following points. So we should reopen the case file, as I sometimes say, right? So only if you see a need to reopen the case file will you do it, whether that's to do with external circumstances or just, your own point of view. You say, maybe this ayah should be looked at from another angle. People like Imam al-Alusi, they mentioned, well, Abu Muslim took this view and it's pointless, and also it goes against the narrations of the Salaf. And interestingly, Alusi himself hardly tells you anything about the narrations, because when you look through them, and I give some details in my paper, you would find that they are not actually very, they're not narrations from the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself. They are not necessarily all that explicit in what happened. They're not necessarily all that authentic. There's a variety of things going on in the narrations, but I think that people like Imam al-Alusi, rahimahullah, overstated the case for these narrations and how binding they should be in understanding the verse. So last point, although this is quite a lot here, but it's the last few points. Very key question to ask is, what is the point of the verse? Okay, and I use the word point because, like I said, Alusi, also Safiur Rahman Mubarak Puri in the footnote to Amrit Sari's tafsir, he says, what the author has mentioned here, what is the point of it? And they've done all this for no point. They're making all these arguments for what point? What a pointless thing it is for the ayah to mean what Abu Muslim says it means. But already I hope I've indicated to you that there is a strong point in this ayah, according to Abu Muslim's reading. In fact, I believe it is much more fruitful and meaningful than the standard interpretation. The standard interpretation tells you Ibrahim had some kind of level of doubt in God's ability to resurrect, or some doubt affected him. So he asked to see it with his own eyes, and he was given that opportunity to see it with his own eyes. And therefore, seeing something with your own eyes is a cause for rest in your heart. Now, of course, we as the readers of the Quran then do not get that itmi'nan al-qalb, because we are not seeing what Ibrahim saw. In Abu Muslim's reading, we are seeing what Ibrahim saw, because what Ibrahim saw was the understanding and the connection of, okay, now I understand that the fact that God created everything means that of course everything will come rushing back to him. And I understand that that's how resurrection takes place. So it becomes not an ayah that's telling you about one supernatural event or miracle that took place, if we can call it a miracle, but at least a supernatural event of resurrection, an event that took place in the past. It becomes now a rational demonstration that applies to every reader of the Quran. We can all appreciate the point made, and it is very spiritually impactful in my humble point of view, because I find it impactful. So I believe that others will as well. A series of questions can be asked. We won't go into the details. My paper does to some extent. You can ask, how does this fit in the preceding stories? We have Ibrahim with Nimrud, and the king is challenging that, I can give life to the dead, or I give life and death. And then Ibrahim says, bring the sun from the west if you are really as powerful as you claim you are, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings it from the east. So that's one question. How does it fit in? And does that help us to determine which side is right? How does it relate to other Quranic passages? What do we link it to? Rashid Rida very nicely links this to the question of Musa. Musa alayhi salam asked, Rabbi arini, look, the same words. Rabbi arini, the only two places the arini comes in the Quran. Rabbi arini anzur ilayk. My Lord, show me so I may look upon you. And when he asked for this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give him exactly that, but he gave him the most that a person is able to handle. He said, look at the mountain. And then the Lord manifested himself and his glory upon the mountain crumbled. Moses falls, unconscious. So he was given something, he witnessed something, but the most that a person could witness in this life at least, right? Likewise, Ibrahim alayhi salam is not able to be put in the position of the resurrector. He cannot really understand what it's like to be God. In the standard view, by the way, the only way to understand كيف تحيي الموتى, the only way to understand that is Ibrahim is given the power of the resurrector. He becomes a muhyi. So now he understands how God, and that's theologically a little bit problematic, isn't it? Whereas in AbuMuslim's view, he is given the opportunity to understand. And finally, how does it compare to Genesis and the commentaries? In my personal view, Genesis 15 has very little, if anything, to do with this passage. I do not find the correspondences to be strong. I find it is misleading to try to link them, but I make that argument in my paper and say, well, there might be some connection, but someone needs to work harder to show us why we should take it seriously. In Genesis, it is not 4 birds. It is 4 different animals, and the 4th one is a bird. Or it is 5 animals and the last 2 are birds, depending on how you read it. So it may be 4 animals, the last one is a bird. Ibrahim comes and he cuts the animals in half, but he doesn't cut the birds. The main question for me in the paper was, does this help us to understand the ayah 260 of Al-Baqarah? Does it help us to decide and to do tarjih between AbuMuslim's view and the Jumhur? I think it does not help us, because even if it is connected, it doesn't clarify the issue. So that's where I'll end, inshallah. And for further reading and viewing, my paper is open access at the Journal of Quranic Studies. I also have done a video, which you can find on my YouTube channel, Ibn Ashur Center for Quranic Studies, where I go through the paper in depth and into the footnotes and all the details and nooks and crannies of it. So I thank you so much for your patience. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
And Dr. Sohaib, thank you very much for this amazing and insightful talk. If you have any question, we can get it from the audiences, and also you can, as I said, either ask in person or write them in the chat. I can read them for you if you want. So do we have any question? Sümeyye Hoca, please go ahead.
Ustaz, I really want to thank you for, especially also for the exciting talk as well, because we as academics, we are very, cold-blooded people. So it's also nice to see the more exciting part of the that's life, and I think that will be inspiring for our students as well. So thank you for that as well. Also, you're giving us, I'm very very much a layperson in terms of the tafsir study, so I'm quite unfamiliar with most of the stuff, but I think as far as I have been reading this stuff when I was an undergrad. It seems like you have been bringing together many, we are not familiarized with seeing so many dimensions of different literatures being together. So seeing, for example, Rashid Reza there, the Mu'tazili studies there, you would find them being studied by Kalam people on the one hand, Tafsir people on the other hand, modern thought, modern Islamic thought, or contemporary Islamic thought people on the other hand. So you're bringing them together as well. So I find that very interesting too. And in terms of the, hard work, in terms of the wordings, etc., the context, etc. So I really find your talk very inspiring, and I hope that our students will take this as an, as an example for them for the own work as well. My questions in terms of the background to the interpretations of Rashid Reza and AbuMuslim. So they seem to have similar views, but do you think their motivations were the same? So that would be my thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that different people have adopted this view with different kind of motivations, and it's fair to ask about motivations. For me, for myself, I like to think that my only motivation is trying to get to the truth, you know, as much as we can. But you're always, of course, influenced by your environment and your society and so on. As I indicated, I think that a common assumption would be it is based on a kind of denial of miracles. And I think that with Rashid Rida, there is a tendency towards that, and you know, some supernatural things, like their particular way of understanding the jinn, for example. And these are famous issues that are raised with Abdu and Rida, for example. So it may well be that that is a reason that he inclined to that view. And he mentions Abu Muslim, and he praises Abu Muslim and says that, you know, he's very independent-minded and very great observations. Abu Muslim, perhaps we don't know enough about in order to get a very clear sense of his orientation on this. Yes, he's Mu'tazili, but as I said, other Mu'tazila were not inclined to accept what he said here. And one of the main things that they actually objected to, one of the main points that they made, was that he's broken Ijma'. And that's an interesting kind of argument. But it's the same argument that is being made by others outside the Mu'tazila. So what this is not doing, this is not ticking the box for the Mu'tazila, I would say. If you were to ask, you didn't mention specifically, but the Ahmadiyya, for example, why do they adopt this view? I think, again, they've got very particular reasons related to their point of view about resurrection. And my personal theory is it's related to the fact that because they believe that their founder was the Messiah and was the return of Jesus, so there is no Jesus to come back, who is Jesus himself. But for them, Isa alayhi salam is dead and cannot come back. And then they make this a general principle that no one can be resurrected within this life. And therefore, even the birds, you know, they can't really countenance that those birds are going to be resurrected. So they have to find another interpretation so that that event does not happen. Whereas for me, I have no problem at all with the idea that what happened is Ibrahim took birds and chopped them. And I just think that that's not what the ayah is talking about. It could be, but I don't think that that's what the ayah is talking about. And Allah knows best.
Can I quickly add a follow-up? So, for example, you said in your talk, denying the resurrection background to this particular ayah doesn't mean that people themselves are kind of distant to the idea of miracles, right? Have you tested it within your readings? So, for example, have you tested it within the same people when they were talking about the ayahs on, the burning, the fire, confrontation of Ibrahim with the fire, etc. Do you think that kind of can be, or would that give you an extra, proof for that?
That's a great question, and it is a very good idea to test that carefully. But I mean, I'm speaking firstly about myself. I have no problem with with all the miracles, and I don't have a general inclination to explain them in other ways. And yet, I'm inclined to this view of the ayah. And some of the people that I mentioned in their translations, I'm sure that we would find them affirming other things.
John, I think the rarity would be those who accept miracles, and like your position would be the rarity in terms of the classics. That's why I think that would be an interesting case. So people who are very classically reading who are very close to the classic interpretation in general, but still reading the ayah in a more rationalistic way, or I think that would be another interesting. But thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly is a more rationalistic way, but that is to say, they understand that God is making a rational demonstration rather than this describing a physical event of resurrection. I just see it as very easy to separate the specific, from the general rule. So in plenty of other verses, there are things being brought back to life, and I don't doubt those for a second. The question is whether this is another one of those, or whether it is something else. Yeah. So yeah, but it's worth comparing, as you said, with other such verses. So Muhammad Ali, for example, from the Lahori Ahmadis, he has a completely different separate explanation for what comes before about when they slaughter the calf, and then they're to take a part of the calf and strike the dead body of the murder victim with it, in order so that he came back to life. And this is how the exegetical tradition explains it. He has a completely different explanation, because for the Ahmadiyya, they've got to avoid this scenario of people coming back to life as much as they can, so that it cannot be said that Jesus died and came back to life, or is going to come back to life at the end of time. They have to say he's dead, so the promised Messiah must be a different person. So a lot of times, of course, interpretations are theologically motivated in a way like this.
We have another question from Dr. Elif Tokay. She's also a specialist in history of religion. Hocam, please.
Thank you. I found your talk very, very interesting. I haven't thought on this ayah from this perspective, so it was very informative. It reminded me the long history of the ancient Israelite people. You know, it took thousands and thousands years for the Israelite to reach on the belief on just one God, monotheism, and they have been very reluctant to accept the bodily resurrection. There are still many Jews who find it really difficult to believe in resurrection. So I really found a connection between Genesis 15, but I haven't worked on it deeply. But it made me think that although they found animal sacrifice vital, they were so far away from believing in bodily resurrection. And as I told you before, it took ages and ages for them. So it reminded me the long history and the Genesis 15, the different animals in this biblical verse appeared to me as a sign for the Jewish people for a very for a very basic and visible explanation of resurrection, but they needed to reach this point until they met with Babylonian culture. So Abraham came from Babylonia, but they had to return to Babylonia hundreds and hundreds of years later. So it occurred to me, it's like a circle. So it took a time for them to believe in the gods being only one to worship to, and Abraham showed them as the first patriarch the right way, but they didn't find it at the first step. So I found a connection between Genesis 15 and inclination is important as well, because it took for a very long time for Israelites to come to terms with their prophets. So they were made millions and millions of nations, but they couldn't come together as one nation. So these three things came to my mind, and it made me read the verse in another perspective. So I will think on it. Thank you very much for this comparative interpretation.
Thank you so much. And I really also in Quranic studies in the Western Academy generally now, biblical parallels are extremely, important in the discourse. So I knew that by writing this paper, I'll probably meet some disagreement from a lot of my colleagues. So I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of ideas can be brought out. Because I'm saying, look, people have just been too relaxed about just saying Genesis 15, same thing, but I think is very different. So I'm just saying that harder work needs to be done in the way that you're indicating, to think about what could be the connection here. And I should say that there are a number of different attempts to read the ayah symbolically in relation to nations. I mentioned the Ahmadiyya, but there are others who have done so in different ways, and maybe some of the Muslim thinkers and Mufassirs were influenced by Genesis 15 in that. But even within the Quranic parallels, one which I heard recently from one of my teachers, Dr. Akram Nadwi, who is from the Farahian school of tafsir, he mentioned that this could be connected to Ibrahim asking, he's being told, وَأَذِّن فِي النَّاسِ بِالْحَجِّ, call out to all mankind to the pilgrimage, and they're going to come from every corner of the earth. They're going to come on every riding animal and on foot. And so he might have been asking, how are they going to hear me? How are they going to answer my call? Yes. So he's been given this example almost to illustrate that, even if that is on a kind of secondary level or on a lower, deeper level, it's possible. So there's no end to how much there is to ponder on the words of Allah.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the audience? If you have questions, please raise your hands or just, write them in the chat. Let's wait. This is your last chance to ask. Okay, here we go. A really great presentation to start. Thanks a lot.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Mohammed Taha or Mehmet Taha is thanking you for the presentation. And any other questions or contribution or anything? Okay, I guess not. Dr. Sohaib Saeed, thank you very much for this amazing talk. I'd like to thank you on behalf of İstanbul University Faculty of Theology. We are very pleased to have you among us today, and we would have like you to be here physically in Istanbul.
Next time, inshallah. Next
time, hopefully, if you have some delicious food and sightseeing here. Also, I'll recommend you to follow Dr. Sohaib on Twitter. He's very he's a Twitter phenomenon as well.
Oh,
yeah, you can
know this.
Thank you again for your time and for your energy. We really appreciate it and benefit from your talk. And Sümeyye Hoca, Elif Hoca, do you have anything to add, or we can end the session and not take too much time of Dr. Sohaib?
Jazakallahu khairan, Ustaz. We would like to see you here in Istanbul. Thanks again.
Inshallah. Take care, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.